All right. Welcome back, everybody. My name is Keith Humphreys. I am, along with Rob Malenka and Brian Knudsen, the coordinators of NeuroChoice, an initiative supported by Wu Tsai that focuses on addiction and is obviously our subject today. I have the best job in the world today, which is I get to host what we're calling fireside chats. So our thought was that obviously you've already heard terrific talks about addiction by world-leading neuroscientists. You're going to hear more. But we also want to connect the work we do with the broader world. And so we have two fireside chats today, people who are very interested in addiction, but not as neuroscientists, from other vantage points. The second fireside chat starts at 12:45, and that is with Lenny Bernstein of the Washington Post. And the one we're having now is with someone I'm proud to call a friend, Mariano-Florentino Cuéllar. Let me tell you a bit about his extraordinary career. So, Tino Cuéllar is a remarkable jurist and scholar, and we're proud to say someone with many connections to Stanford University. After graduating from Harvard and Yale Law School, he received a PhD here in political science. He then worked at the Treasury Department, as well as served as a clerk for Chief Judge Mary Schroeder on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. Then he came back to us as the Stanley Morrison Professor of Law, and he held many leadership positions in the Freeman Spogli Institute until he became the overall director. Amidst all that, he somehow found time to take a leave of absence to work for President Obama at the White House Domestic Policy Council, where he led teams responsible for civil and criminal justice, public health, and immigration, as well as its efforts to repeal the military's Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, and to enact bipartisan public health, food safety, and sentencing reform legislation. He was then appointed in 2015 by Governor Jerry Brown as justice on our state Supreme Court, in which he served with distinction, deciding cases on a wide range of issues, including climate change, separation of powers, international treaty obligations, criminal justice, and privacy and technology. Now, on the very off chance you are already feeling intimidated, he just stepped down from the court to become the president of one of the world's most important think tanks, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. So please welcome Tino Cuéllar.
Thank you. Thank you, my good friend and co-author, Keith, and thank you all of you for being here. I will say I'm about to become the president. I have not yet become the president, so I have about 10 days to fix every problem in California law if I can. So if you have suggestions and ideas of what you want to see tweaked in California law, now is the time.
I won't be surprised if you actually do that. No, as I do. So
one of the strange things about being here right now, I just have to say this just as an observation of like how life feels. This is probably the first live event I have done since the pandemic disrupted all of our lives, and more than disrupted many of people we know and family members and friends and whatnot. And I'll say, like, it is incredibly renewing of hope to be in person, even with the mask on. One of the weirder things about the pandemic period for me was so many lunches that I scheduled with people where lunch meant like they were on a screen and I was on a screen, and we would eat our separate lunch. So now I was looking forward to literally like when you say you're going to be with somebody, you actually are with somebody, but there's no fire. There's supposed to be a fireside chat. So I just want to say I want some of my money back.
Okay, fair enough.
That said, it's really an honor to be here.
Fair enough. Very glad to have you. So we're going to generally talk about addiction, and then move into some more areas after that about neuroscience and how law negotiates issues about choice and responsibility. And we will have time towards the end for your questions as well. So why don't we start, Tino, with the epidemic of opioid addiction and overdose, which the U.S. is struggling with still. And one point you've made in your writings is that it was not initiated by people outside the law. It wasn't gangs in Colombia. It wasn't warlords in Afghanistan growing poppy fields. It was legally chartered, ostensibly well-regulated U.S. companies like Purdue Pharma and Johnson & Johnson, Cardinal Health. So if we want to understand why this happened, we have to understand what the law and regulatory problems were that brought us to this point. When you look at it, what was it that we did wrong in how we regulated corporations that we ended up with this human tragedy that has cost hundreds of thousands of lives?
Keith, thank you. The short answer from my perspective as a scholar and as somebody who's been around the policy-making process for a while, and to some extent as a jurist, is our society is extraordinarily powerful at getting things done when we focus our attention on it. When we neglect problems, all kinds of bad things happen. And the neglect can come in different forms. So let's start with the fact that we have an incredibly vibrant and dynamic economy, an innovative economy that is built around what I describe as the first real artificial intelligence technology we had, which is the corporate form. If you think about it, human beings, we work together in all kinds of ways. Evolution has made us that way. But it took us thousands of years to develop a particular form of legal organization that would create effectively an artificial person to which we could delegate responsibility and to which we could expect, from whom we could expect some fiduciary activity. But that word fiduciary is really tricky, right? Because in almost every corporate form that we humans have developed for hundreds of years, the fiduciary relationship goes from like a board to a set of shareholders and not to society. And if everything were organized for the benefit of society, we might find some real challenges, even just in agreeing what that meant. That's why we have representative government, democracy, and so on, and it works imperfectly. So you have this corporate form, you have a set of incentives, you have a set of processes unfolding, and when we face a pandemic crisis, for example, and there's public money there, and there's regulatory oversight, we give the world vaccines, and we don't give them enough vaccines, but we can best many other countries, when instead we define problems narrowly. So think about how we define the drug problem for so much of our professional lives, and you've worked on this so closely. We worked together on this in the Obama administration when you were on the CP. When we define the drug problem too much as a law enforcement problem that has to do with illicit substances, all kinds of other problems can develop. Let me add one more thing, which is, if anybody ever tells you that government is either completely inefficient, doesn't ever get anything done right, or that government works perfectly, and as long as we just delegate to government, everything goes perfectly, they're going to be wrong. And this group knows it. The really messy, interesting problems that keep us all up at night have to do with the reality that we cannot live without public institutions that help us hold each other accountable, but at the same time, they don't work very well. And one of the particular problems we've written about, I've spent a lot of time studying, is a lack of coordination of different pieces of the system. And just to give you two examples of this, we have a whole civil justice system which is about holding people accountable around harms they do to each other. And then we have a criminal justice system designed to hold people accountable for harms they do against the people writ large. They don't particularly coordinate. They have different legal standards. There isn't one particular organization in charge of everything. We have states and we have the federal government. A lot of that is by design. But the impact of that in practice is that when there isn't a lot of political pressure, things fall through the cracks for years. And then when we wake up to a problem, we have a big disconnect. And then just, going broader, I think about this from the perspective of a lot of the challenges you all face, thinking about people who are themselves struggling with addiction, and think about how incredibly difficult it is for them to go to one place to get all the help that they need. So these are the things that keep us up at night. We've done okay, but we can do much better.
If you were king, and I'm not putting it past you that you will be someday, what would you do if you could make one change in law or regulation about how we handle products that are, of course, very helpful in terms of medicine, but also have an addictive component to them, addictive risk to them? What do you think the big lever is that you would want to pull?
I think I would create an agency in government that it would be called the Unintended Consequences Bureau. And unintended is a little bit of a loaded word here, right? Because, it's one thing to say, like, nobody wanted the worst to happen. Nobody wanted an epidemic of addiction to be just like spreading across the country with a legal substance that was designed to deal with a very real problem that humans had. But you know what? If it works out this way, like, maybe that's okay. Maybe it's somebody else's problem. And then there's like, we didn't see it coming at all, right? When I think about artificial intelligence, it's a totally different field, but in some ways you have similar questions coming up, like what will these technologies do to our brains and to each other 5 years out, 10 years out, 20 years out? And I'd have this bureau staffed with people who have two different kinds of functions. One function would be to learn and listen to scholars, to members of Congress, to people in the public. People could write in. There could be like an ombuds function. But then there'd be another group of people who'd have some authority. They'd have subpoena power in particular to make sure that we could get the story told. Mm-hmm. And let me drop a footnote here about courts. So one of the things that's different about working in the executive branch versus the courts is most of the time when you're in the courts, you're experiencing things ex post. Things have happened already. And now the question is, how does society take its legal commitments and do something about it? In the executive branch, we mostly were trying to be forward-looking. Like Congress has created this statute to deal with this problem going forward, food safety, drug abuse prevention. Like, how do you do things to prevent harm as best we can? And I would note that one of the ex post functions that courts do serve, and do serve pretty well, is an accounting function. Think about tobacco, for example. Mm-hmm. We have generated huge financial resources to help the world deal with the health consequences of what have to help America deal with it, but also millions of pages of documents that, through a fair legal process that gives everybody their due, including the companies themselves, these things can become part of the public record. And I do think this bureau, I imagine, would want to try to develop that ability to tell a story before as much harm happens.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I love it.
And you can run it, by the way.
Yeah, I'm big on unintended consequences. That's kind of my life. Let me ask specifically about the FDA, because you've worked on food safety and drug safety, so understand that agency. And it is an agency we ask an enormous amount of to do an extraordinary range of things. And it's often criticized as being criticized now over a decision about an Alzheimer's drug, very familiar sorts of things. People saying, look, they're taking care of private sector, but they're not taking care of the public and all that kind of thing. How much of that is a fair criticism, and how much of that is just the inevitability of, given how the law is structured and one agency with big responsibilities, we should feel they've mostly done things as well as can be expected? Like where is that problem?
I think the FDA employees that I've worked with that are most impressive, and there are many, it's been a real privilege to work with them mostly. The best ones, most of them, would say what I'm about to say, which is it works well, but it could work a lot better. And I think what I like about the folks who have made their career in the FDA, who've contributed to it or rotated into really demanding positions as principal deputy commissioner or chief counsel, is that they're ambitious for the agency. And here, those of you who studied economics and read the public finance, public economics literature, you know that there's a kind of strand in the academic thinking that runs through the work of people like William Niskanen that understands agencies and their ambitions to be about more and more jurisdiction. That has not been my experience, okay? Like when I've worked with the State Department or the ATF, they often would say like, this is a political headache. I'd rather not deal with it. Can you please give it to another agency? So I think it's way oversimplified to think of this ambition point as we just want more power, more resources, more jurisdiction. When I say ambition, what I mean is that these folks mostly want their agency to be even better, to be more precise in the way they use intellectual and academic data, to be more fast at getting to the decision making that they need, to be more serious about integrating an epigenetics perspective, to be more thoughtful about how issues like climate will intersect with the FDA and the health conditions that it's likely to have to deal with over time. That said, I feel like an agency like the FDA depends so much on a particular cadre of people who are mostly political appointees, but not all, also some very senior career folks, who are sort of like technocratic, politically sophisticated, savvy people, right? They can brief Congress, they get how the budget process works, they understand there's no point in pissing off members of Congress for no good reason, but they also hold together the integrity of the agency. And I think it would be a mistake to assume that as one administration changes to the other, that cadre is not affected and sometimes damaged, right? Yeah. So the agency is its future really depends on finding phenomenal people to occupy those positions.
Can you raised the issue of the lawsuits around tobacco, and a very common thing, as you know, in American life, that we try to sort of make up things after the fact. Maybe the laws weren't set up right, they were exploited, there's harm, and now we'll fix this, or at least give people some relief for their suffering through the lawsuits. We have massive suits going through against various aspects of the opioid industry. When you look at that, do you see it optimistically, like this will bring this to a close, this will change regulation, or will it be more like tobacco where a lot of the money was spent on the wrong things, for example? I mean, how do you appraise that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll be a little general about this because I'm still a judge. And
okay.
I'll say, all these places where the American system of justice intersects with public health is kind of a glass half empty, glass half full story. Like I will say, let's take another public health issue, which is not addiction, but I think has some interesting similarities, particularly to the lawful pharmaceutical product side, and that's auto safety. So you've got Congress involved through big statutes and money. You've got the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. You've got the car companies. But you also had a lot of litigation happening that created a set of pressures on private actors that ultimately led to responses. And yet, when I have taught administrative law here, there's like no way to do that without teaching the State Farm case, which is about a sort of 15 to 18 year long process to make some adjustments in the technologies that would make people safe in the cars, particularly airbag and seatbelt technologies. And it was on again, a requirement, off again, new administrations would come in, there'd be litigation about it, an agency would say, yes, we're going forward, no, we're not. Then there was a continuous buzzer. And in the end, the intersection of all this redounds to the conclusion that we get it right, but it takes a long time. And I worry about that. Because going back to the very first question you asked, I think the story I would tell on the opioid stuff and on tobacco is, with a long enough time horizon, before the point where we're all dead, which we all will be, we sort of come around and get the balance right. And to your point, like sometimes even when there's flows of money in, we sometimes don't fund the right things. But I think if we all think a little bit about the work we're doing through the lens of time frame, that can be really helpful. Not necessarily let's change the outcome, but what if we get to the outcome 10 or 12 years earlier? How many lives would be affected?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I'm sure you get asked this a lot as a judge, so I will ask it to you in the knowledge that you've thought about it. I talk to people, I'm sure you do too, who say, look, there are people in my neighborhood who have been arrested for selling heroin, maybe $1,000 operations, $5,000, $10,000 operations, and they're in prison. Why is it that people who made billions of dollars selling a very potent opioid and caused a lot of addiction and overdose never seem to end up spending a night in jail?
There are a lot of complexities there, let's just say, and somewhat similar complexities arose in the sort of national reckoning that came after the 2008-2009 financial crisis. You could imagine.
Very similar, yeah.
Similar observations. And I guess, in sticking with my theme of the really important questions generally are in a gray area, I would say in no small measure it's because the laws are clearer in some domains than they are in other domains, right? If almost even leave aside the question of what legal representation do people have when they are facing liability for white collar crime or for very, very large civil judgments, leaving that aside even, the interpretive questions, the judgments that have to be made around honest services wire fraud, just to pick one area, versus how easy is it to show that somebody has a certain possession of a certain illicit product. It's a very different ballgame, right? And let's talk about possession for a moment, because this is an interesting domain. So what is the law after when we define a crime around possession? So I'm not going to sit here and judge the social merits of it, but I'll just note that the operation of a possession law is to simplify dramatically the cost, the ambiguity, and the difficulty of proving that somebody committed a crime, right? You're just possessing the darn thing. And it's something that has heavily to do with drugs. But we also see a similar dynamic around terrorism, by the way, where it's one thing to say well, were you intending to support an enterprise that was trying to engage in violence with a political or coercive purpose, versus you were possessing precursor chemicals, not of the kind to make meth, but of the kind to make a bomb. Yeah. And essentially the burden's on you to show that you had a good reason to do that. I mean, the law never formally shifts the burden. It's always on the prosecution to establish somebody's guilty. But here's my point, right? The way you define substantive crimes changes the way our procedures work in practice in a profound way. So it's complicated, right? And look, our country is committed to justice and fairness and equality. It's also committed to making sure that we give people robust opportunities to not feel like they live in a police state. And I think that does come at a cost. Could we do better? Could there be some use for this, unintended consequences agency to refer some cases to the Justice Department? Sure. And I do think over time you can see even the white-collar criminal side of things caught up. But again, we're back to this point about the time frame.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let's take your idea, and I remember you talking about this when we worked in the White House, about how do you want things to be in 5 years, 10 years, and so on. The basic challenge of introducing medications that have good effects and bad effects is way broader than opioids, right? It comes up with stimulants, it comes up with anti-anxiety drugs, and so on. Where would you like us to be as a country in 10 years, and how we consider which one of these to allow doctors to prescribe, and which ones are, we say the risk profile is just too dangerous. Can't do that.
Great question. This is where I get a little bit into the AI stuff and the surveillance stuff, because it gets complicated pretty quickly. I think the really big picture way to answer the question, which has its complexities and its difficulties and its risks, is to say, well, think epigenetics, think AI, think machine learning, think our ability to surveil an Internet of Things. In an ideal world, we have a system that is actually very, very heavily tailored to individuals and what they need. And, in that kind of world, access to a particular pain med that is really not good for 87% of the population, but is good for 10, 13% of the population, can work that way. Mm-hmm. And I think the not easy, but in some ways the easiest piece of this actually is on the front end regulatory side, where even in our age, part of what got me so interested in AI was beginning to see how in the various recesses of the FDA, they were beginning to realize that some of the ways they were going to have to make judgments about the efficacy of particular products was going to be by using pattern recognition technology, neural networks to sort of spot at the molecular level even similarities between particular substances that would then inform and sort of render a little bit more efficient the cycle of testing that would still have to be done to reassure ourselves to understand what we don't know, right? So I think that is promising and important. We have to invest in it. I think, frankly, there are procurement and human capital problems where the greatest expertise is not only not in federal agencies, it's actually not even in pharma companies. It's in places like Google. And that talent should disseminate more. And some of it should be in the public sector, I hope. But now we get to the trickier parts, which is a regulatory regime that ideally leverages what we can know about people and how they are using particular products and technologies, frankly, even their lifestyles, to help them make good choices about what they should use and not use. It's very easy to then blur the line between that and what is scary about authoritarian regimes, obviously, and even just in the, dilemmas around using smartphones and data for COVID safety. We've faced some of these dilemmas. The state of California has faced some of these dilemmas. So I think at core, I'm seeing a problem of trust in government and in each other that will limit potentially our ability to use these technologies to be more precise about what we permit people to do.
Very interesting. I'll shift a little, talk about addiction more generally in the law. Every judge has overseen cases involving addiction, because it's so tied up in many, many different types of crimes. And so it was surprising to me when we were working for Obama, we sent a team of addiction experts over to the Supreme Court and did a briefing on addiction, and it was very warmly received. And the justices and the clerks said, wow, I've never seen a presentation on addiction before. So it shocked me. I would have thought, surely they all get education because they interact with this all the time, but that was wrong. And it makes me wonder, where do most judges get the knowledge they have about addiction, how they think about this person, what they're like.
That is a very generously and diplomatically asked question, I have to say. First, let me just say, in defense of my professional colleagues, and of course, what you say is so true, and you diplomatically asked this, you don't mean to be critical, but I'll say, the real challenge for American judges is we expect so much of our legal system, and we've mostly made a judgment, which I mostly think is the right one, but you can challenge me on that if you want to, that we actually don't do really well with specialist courts. Specialist courts are a very narrow exception in America. There is a court of international trade. There's some specialty courts that do appellate review of patent law and, veterans appeals. But for the most part, we believe that the right way to run a justice system is to have a generalist making judgments who effectively is representing your brain as a member of the public, as a layperson relative to law, not a layperson relative to addiction and medicine and so on, that you have more expertise than I do. But in that score, what the generalist judge has to do, think about it, is find a way to understand it in her own mind that can then be rendered into words that you will basically understand and be able to follow. Specialists don't do that. As a specialist in my own academic areas, I can tell you we are so good at debating the capillaries of this or that narrow academic issue and really bad at explaining why that should matter to the world, even to other smart people. The way we try to ensure against that kind of in the legal system is with generalist judges. Obviously, the problem then is generalist judges have a challenging time keeping up with the background knowledge they're supposed to have. We also try to protect them from making too many judgments about things that really should be case specific because they happen to know Keith Humphrey and Keith Humphrey sort of informed them about it. Like, it's really important to have that background knowledge because otherwise you can't do the job. By the same token, if the precise issue before you is, were these products addictive, there's just a limit to my ability as a judge now to pick up the phone and call you. To stick with, our shared experience of the White House. What I love about the White House, in addition to pretty much everyone would take my call, maybe even John Legend, whatever. But I could call any specialist on anything, and if I didn't reveal classified information, which wasn't too hard to avoid doing, I could ask anybody to give me a little short course on something. And one area that I found deeply relevant to my work at the White House that I had not thought about much at the time, that is going to be relevant to my future job at the Carnegie Endowment, is international trade. So that came up on food, it came up on tobacco, big time, like, can we ban flavorings apropos of addiction for vanilla or lemon or tutti frutti, but have an exception for clove, or is that, an inconsistency, which way does that cut? And I found it invaluable to just pick up the phone and call my colleagues at Stanford who were experts on trade. And I could, talk to them as often as I wanted to, right? I can't do that on the court. So where judges end up getting their information when everything works ideally is through cases and good lawyers. And of course, we depend on the adversarial process and law clerks and so on to help us with that. They also do a little bit of continuing education. In California, we don't like the idea of imposing continuing education on all lawyers, but not on us. So we voluntarily subject ourselves to a continuing education requirement where a good bit of discussion, frankly, is about substance abuse because it's a recurring problem, not only for plaintiffs and defendants, but for lawyers and judges, right? But we could do a lot better. I think, integrating into the day-to-day without crossing the line into case-specific information would be a really nice challenge for the leadership of our courts.
Does it happen in cases, we certainly know in cases, doctors get called, psychologists get called, clinicians who work with addicted people. Do neuroscientists get called very often into cases to opine about whether someone is, capable of exerting self-control or not, for example?
Not so much yet, but it's beginning to happen a little bit more. Like, what used to be exotic and is now a staple of expert testimony is DNA. Like, obviously, that is pretty old-fashioned now at some level. And even now, subject to real nuances in how you, interpret base pairs and confidence levels and, exactly how you take the data and turn it into a statistical assertion you can give lay jurors in a way they will understand. Real challenges we have to this day, and how do you word the jury instructions over that? Like, what counts as really crossing the line? Also, we have an area of law around the confrontation clause in the US Constitution around hearsay law that raises interesting questions about when the person who actually does the testing has to testify so that person can be cross-examined, and when you can just present a report and so on. But neuroscientists is kind of the cutting edge a little bit on that score. I think as our knowledge of the receptors in the brain, the particular processes that affect mental health, physical processes, the chemical properties of particular substances, these machine learning issues I'm talking about, like I can see more of the neuroscience piece, but it's all still going to run into a basic problem. This is where we're going to get a little philosophical. I'll just say, be very brief about this, but I'll just note, when we say somebody is not competent to stand trial, or somebody is insane, can benefit from the insanity defense, which does not happen very often, to be very clear, or that somebody is not acting in a manner that is voluntary. Like, here's just a legal question I'll mention, but I won't say much more about it because it's a pending case, but just like the court granted review on a case that raises, at least at some point in the proceedings, the question of somebody's supposed to be, has a constitutional right to be at their criminal proceeding where they're going to be tried for whether they committed a crime or not. But the person is absent, and the judge decides to proceed. The judge can do that if the person is voluntarily absent, but it was the person voluntarily absent when the person was under the influence of a drug that the person may have been addicted to, right? So I'll stop getting into specifics of that case, but you see how in a situation like that, the court has to make a judgment about what voluntarily absent means. The fit between the scientific paradigms that exist and the legal categories is ambiguous. It's not one-to-one. We in the law have not designed these categories. Well, first of all, we mostly haven't been the ones to design them, right? They're handed down from legislators to us to some degree. They're also developed a little bit in legal doctrine over time, accreted over decades. But they're not meant to play a role that just channels the scientific information. I'd like to believe that scientific information is not irrelevant to these judgments, but it's also not meant to be just a one-to-one relationship. Instead, what are those categories doing? Well, they're channeling moral and ethical judgments that we make as a society about what is supposed to matter in a legal proceeding. And, you've been an academic for a long time. I have too. I am so not convinced that the moral and ethical questions all have a scientific answer.
Oh, yeah,
It's a very different thing to say science is irrelevant, right? It doesn't matter. I certainly wouldn't be caught dead saying that. Don't believe that. But they're sort of different halves of the brain here in some ways, and they have to talk to each other. The corpus callosum matters quite a bit.
Yes. And it doesn't necessarily matter morally. Let's say if we could prove beyond any doubt scientifically that someone is, say, incapable of controlling really violent impulses, it would still raise the question of what does one do? To say, well,
Correct.
It's not their fault, but on the other hand, should the rest of society suffer? And that never goes away. What is the current thing? I mean, the talks we're seeing today in some ways are really, I wouldn't say undermining, or say illuminating basic things about how the brain does things like exert self-control and see the future. And in law, you have to make those judgments. Was this premeditated or not? Did this person have control or not? To what extent, if at all, and don't flatter us, feel free to say none, to what extent does the neuroscience of we're spending our time on today get into those conversations within law about those sort of core concepts of assigning responsibility?
It will come to become more important, particularly, I think, to defendants who, if they have the right resources, will have access to this knowledge. Maybe to very principled regulators who are not in a courtroom but are trying to make judgments about how to develop a system. I mean, think about CDCR, the California Department of Corrections, right? Really, really difficult department to run. I mean, it's up there with being president of Columbia. It's a really hard job, I think. So if you are designing a system for promoting order and well-being in prison, leave aside how many people are in prison, that's not your judgment, society doesn't get that right necessarily, but it's just people come. And how do you create an environment that lives up to at least some of the words in the name of the agency, right? Corrections and rehabilitation. Well, I think the knowledge that is in this room and among your peers is absolutely essential and is sort of well suited for an organization that is ambitious the way my FDA colleagues were ambitious, wanting to do better always, not satisfied they're doing enough, to sort of integrate into their thinking about how do you structure work and feedback to people when they're not doing a good job, and costs and benefits, right? Can we do better? Absolutely. In the courtroom setting, it's a little more overdetermined because society is using the court process, to be perfectly honest, to sort of work out some really deep and honestly very contradictory feelings about the world. Most thoughtful lay people and most legislators, if they're being honest, would tell you in response to a hard question like, do you think behavior is mostly determined by situational factors and genetics or by people's personal choices? They'd be like, you know what? If I'm being honest and the cameras are far away, I would just tell you, I think that's a complicated question. I think there's probably a good bit of both. I think if you really press me, and I remember my undergraduate courses, the legislator might say, some people might reduce even our free will to just a set of physical things that happen, electrons firing and so on. But I can't imagine organizing society without some belief in the narrative that we have some personal choice. And the legislator might say, when I talk to my friends who are psychiatrists, because I do talk to them sometimes, they'll tell me that most, or at least some of the treatments we have for dealing with mental health issues and addiction depend on at least a framework of some degree of personal accountability that I would be loath to like erase from our legal system, even if it's not always literally true for everybody. And there are going to be losers and winners in that process. And I think it's a rather tragic reality. I don't love that. Like, I'm not defending it as much as I'm just acknowledging that it's sort of there with us.
Fantastic. I think that's a great spot for us to close our conversation. And we do have a few minutes, so I want to give all of you a chance to talk to this extraordinary scholar we're blessed to have here today. So we have roving mics, and I see some hands up.
Yeah, there was a story in Wired magazine last month, a sort of investigative story on narc scare. And so I will, in 20 seconds, tell you what it is for the audience. Mm-hmm. It's basically a score that every American has that documents their potential for going on a addictive substance. And apparently all clinicians, all pharmacies, before dispensing a drug to you, will check that score. And it's the harmful effect is that a lot of people who need, who have, a good faith need for analgesic substance are actually prevented from obtaining them. And it's one company that has never really explained where they get the data and how they've built the algorithm. And so the magazine said it's a huge scandal, national scandal that nobody knows about.
That's really interesting. I look forward to reading the article.
Good question.
I'll just say one more thing about it, which is, in my answer to Keith's really good question about the future, you could probably hear the tensions that sort of are reflected in that sort of ambition. Like, surely a combination of data, technology, governance will help prevent some harm from happening, but how much are we actually willing to forego those potential benefits to just not have a system that makes too many assumptions about us?
Question here.
Hi, thank you so much for this conversation. My name is Rana Hashemi. I'm a master's student in the community health program. I'm also a drug educator in the community. And in 2016, we legalized cannabis. And with that did not come any shifts to our drug education funding or in regulations. Currently, there's no federal funding available for drug education after DARE was found to be ineffective, and there's no standards or regulations the same way we have for comprehensive sex education. And so all of this is obviously to promote the betterment of communities, and we know that primary prevention is important for young people. So what is the role of the law in mandating that we are protecting youth as we are also holding accountable regulations and creating and shifting the legal landscape for substance use?
That's a great question. I think there's a limit to what one can expect from the courts on that score, but I think the ambition can be well dealt with in the federal and state executive and legislative branches. Just to say a little more about that, we in the courts have to deal with incredible pain that is reflected in the lives of people who often end up in court. And by the way, we think of civil and criminal as different. We organize them as different. But so many of the people who actually show up in court on criminal offenses, criminal charges, substance abuse issues, and so on. They have like all kinds of civil justice problems too, like there are debt issues, there are housing issues, there are mental health issues. So like I think we, the courts, can do better at educating and maybe even finding resources to educate at the local level the consequences of all those disconnects and the way so much of this is local. At the local level, those connections can be made more effectively. But I also think you raise a really terrific point for the legislature and for the executive branch around DARE. You know, we were there when we're dealing with just trying to make the pot of funding for, you know, drug abuse prevention and treatment just more well-informed by good policy and scientific knowledge. That's a difficult, heavy lift because just about every program that is funded has its coalition of supporters, and every program that isn't funded has its enemies that have stopped it from being funded. But nothing that I've seen in the research on DARE suggests, and this is kind of the burden of the point of your question, that drug education generally is not helpful. But you know, the degree of experimentation that we should do around new models for drug education, new ways of integrating it at different points in the curriculum, and also, you know, differences in our strategies for adults versus for young folks. I think it's a really untapped area, and it deserves additional funding.
Thank you. Why don't we take a question from online?
Oh, hello, people online, by the way. I've been there with you for a long time. It's nice to not see you, but to know there. Thank you for being here.
Can you hear me? Yes. We have a question from Sonia Gaur. She says, child psychiatrists who prescribe stimulants to children are expected to check the Cure's website on children taking the medication due to the unintended consequences of the opioid crisis. How can we as professionals, through the California Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, make changes at Sacramento through our own lobbyist representing child psychiatrists and the mental health needs of children? And I asked her for a clarification, and she means about changing this obligation to check the Cure's website for prescribing specific meds.
Thank you. I'm going to stay a little general because, you know, these things come before the courts and all that. But I just think in general, we talked quite a bit today about the challenge of making sure that judges were well educated and thoughtfully exposed to different kinds of information. I think a similar challenge arises with respect to, oh, there we go, that's better. A similar challenge arises with respect to legislators. And some of that can happen through formal channels, like testimony before the legislature. But frankly, so much turns on legislative staff. I will tell you, just as when we worked in government, we realized that whatever grand ideas a political appointee might have, the truth is some career official who'd been there 9 years or 12 years and knew the pots of money and knew the statutory regime, knew the people in Congress, was so pivotal, and you almost needed to persuade that person. I think you cannot underestimate the importance of the folks who advise, the state senators, the state assembly folks, and just kind of educating them, giving them a sense of how different points of view play out will be something that goes a long way. And I think that all the issues we've talked about today, certainly the one that was just brought up by the questioner, are good examples of how there's going to have to be a learning process. It's going to take a while. It's going to require different disciplines. And it will require many, it will bring you to many reversals where you don't feel like you're getting traction, but it's important to continue.
Well, I'm sad to say we are out of time, but I'm happy to say this was a wonderful session thanks to you, Tino. Thank you very much.